into now. We wrapped up the then portion of our discussion with hearing how Sadie, Erica, and I left Mississippi after college. Brain drain, where college graduates, particularly those in engineering, math, and physical sciences, leave Mississippi for higher paying jobs and greater career opportunity, is getting more attention these days. Mississippi House Bill 1550, offering tax breaks to those who earn bachelor's or professional degrees and stay in Mississippi or move into the state to work, died in committee last March. So I'd like to open up this section by asking Weston, looking at education and employment opportunity and considering rights won in the civil rights movement, where are we today in Mississippi?
I think we have a long way to go because, well, we have challenges in the legislature. For instance, they're attempting to move public dollars towards private education and charter schools, and so there's this illusion of school choice as being the way forward, whereas some people see that as more of a way to revert back towards segregation, where you have, it is a choice for students to go to what school they would choose, but it's also a choice for the schools to choose the students. And so you would have a situation where some students don't get accepted into the better schools with more funding, and then other schools are left in the deteriorating school districts that are struggling to make it already. As far as employment opportunities, we know that brain drain is a real serious issue across the state, where our brightest kids are coming up in our school districts, and then they're going off to college, but they're not coming back. And that's because we don't have opportunity for them. And I think that's been stifled by several things like greed and corruption and a lack of vision overall. I have an older friend, his name's Tommy, he's from Meridian. He moved away for about 50 years, and then about 15 years ago he came back. And he realized that in the time he had been gone, not much progress had been made. While in other parts of the state, maybe you saw development occur and more opportunity to be had. Here in East Mississippi, there was just limited growth in a 50-year period. So Tommy set out to figure out why that was, what caused such stagnant growth for so long. And most recently, Tommy sued the Board of Supervisors for violating the Open Meetings Act. And what Tommy's getting at is that when you have so few people in a small area like this control so much of the property, the means of production, and concentrate political power on top of all of that, then your opportunities for more people outside that select group to have real economic gains is really it's really scarce, and it's not really, there's not much opportunity if you're not inside those groups or those cliques. And that's the reality that we face. And I think that there are new economic models that provide a way out, but it's going to take a lot of what took place during the civil rights era, which is organizing, educating, and moving forward with a common vision and a purpose. And so we can look at ways to encourage cooperative businesses where instead of all the gains going towards the top, you have maybe 10 people who own the business together. We can look at programs that are already underway in Meridian to emphasize STEM education. So we're going to be, there's programs like the Ladders Academy that are going to be training 1,200 students or so to do everything from computer coding to app development. And then we can find ways to crowdsource investment opportunities to give people their own opportunity here to take an idea and actually get it off the ground by utilizing technology that would allow for just using the internet. You have a website like GoFundMe.com, and you take the best ideas around here and you promote them on a national level and allow for people to pull their investments together to make opportunity happen where it hasn't before. And so while in East Mississippi we don't have a long list of economic successes historically, when you look at what's already underway here in recent years, I think you could realistically say that in the next 10 years or so, we could see a dent in our poverty rate and start actually moving forward and not being stagnant for another 50 years.
in over 150 U.S. cities. President Lyndon Johnson appointed a committee to investigate. The Kerner Report warned that continued racial segregation and discrimination would lead us to two societies, one black, one white, separate and unequal. Our divisions in the 60s were racial and economic, black versus white, the economically better off versus the poor. I'd like to get each panelist's thoughts on two questions. What divides us today as Americans, and how do those divisions compare to the divisions of the 60s, beginning with Sadie?
He says that's a tough one. Yes, it is. But honestly, I think we're still in the same boat. I really do. I think it's a few who are trying to make a difference, and we're going to have to get everybody else on board. I don't know how to do that. But I do know that situations like this one today, we can go back and we can let others know what has transpired, that we can do better. We can encourage others. We can be an example more and more every day. I've put forth an effort since 9/11 to make sure that when I'm out in the public every day, whoever I meet, I speak. I would always speak anyway. Sometimes people wouldn't speak back, but now it's mutual. So we have to put forth that extra effort to be different. Things are not going to change if we don't step out. I think that racial divide and that economic divide go hand in hand. Sometimes we say the white man won't let us have, but sometimes we don't look for it either. We say we're trying to be, that keeps me down. Well, you know what? Pick your butt up. I say, and sometimes I guess my young people think that I'm a little tougher now than I used to be, and I probably am, because I do know what the world has to offer. And I think we're missing a lot of it because we're lazy. Apathy is a big problem. We've allowed our young people to be spoiled. And when I say spoiled, I think everybody knows what I'm talking about. Mama said I'm not going to treat them the way my mama treated me. So we're going to have to get over that mentality and be parents and allow our children to grow up the way they're supposed to. Economically, we still have problems because there are money issues. There are issues where income is still inadequate. It's not the same. It's not equal. There are job opportunities that we still don't have. But the doors are opened. So we need to move our children into those areas where they can do what I had intended for us all to do when I stepped through the doors of Meridian High.
Our country's divisions are definitely an American, not a Southern problem. So let me talk about Minnesota, where I live now. We consistently top national lists. Number 1 for kids' well-being. Second, happiest state. Best in preparing students for college as measured by ACT scores. It would be easy to think we might be doing some things right, arguably better than Ferguson or Mississippi, but we also have to consider some other rankings. In December 2014, the financial news site 24/7 Wall Street ranked Minnesota as the second worst state for blacks to live. More recently, a Wallet Hub analysis identified Minnesota as the worst state for financial inequality between blacks and whites. And the Minnesota Spokesman Recorder has asserted that Minnesota has perfected the new Jim Crow. Not quite 2 years ago, near where I used to live, Philandro Castillo, a 32-year-old black man, was shot and killed by a police officer after being pulled over in Falcon Heights, a suburb of St. Paul. Over 52,000 Minnesotans have their voices silenced every year due to a felony conviction. and current law disproportionately impacts people of color in Minnesota. We're still divided by race and money. I'm reminded of Reconstruction, the period immediately following the Civil War. One of my favorite authors, Howard Fast, wrote about that time, and he said this: when the 8-year period of Negro and white freedom and cooperation in the South was destroyed, it was destroyed completely. Not only were material things wiped out and people slain, but the very memory was expunged. Powerful forces did not hold it to be a good thing for the American people to know that once there had been such an experiment and that the experiment had worked. It can be to the advantage of those in power to divide us, as happened during Reconstruction and as happens today. That injustice, though, is much harder to perpetrate on a society that knows its history.
Much hasn't changed. What we saw in the 60s, the racial and economic divides very much still exist today. Sometimes I almost feel it's worse. Something came to mind. I thought about when Barack Obama was elected president of the United States in 2008. There are many of us thought that racism had ended. And I knew that wasn't true, just because of what I see and what I read, just throughout the news cycle and what I experienced. So I knew racism was still alive, and it began to show its head right after his inauguration. And I'm pretty sure many of you may remember what Mitchell O'Connor, the current Senate Majority Leader, said was to make sure that he's a one-term president and that he's not successful. And then you began to see them start doing all kinds of things to make sure that nothing that he tried to do could pass. And it made me think and made me realize that racism is very much alive in this country. And I tell you, there was a thought, and I'll never forget, it was that summer of 2009 when the Congress was battling Barack in every way. Didn't want to pass anything that he would propose. And if he proposed it was the right thing to do, they'd oppose it. And I almost said one night, I said, I almost wish Barack Obama would have never been elected. But I knew I was crazy, because it certainly was a milestone, a major milestone, that he was elected president of the United States. That actually never happened in my lifetime. But the way he was being treated, you knew that racism was still deeply rooted in this country. And then when you look today, 11 o'clock a.m., November 8th, 2016, I turned my television off because I knew what the results were going to be when I woke up November 9th that morning. And what it did when Trump was elected president of the United States, it really exposed just how deep racism is still in this country. People became emboldened with their racism. I mean, they just seemed like they could talk about it as boldly as they could. Even seemed to be more bold than what they would do during the 60s. At least sometimes it was somewhat hidden, but there were some bold people out there as well. But it still exists today. I almost feel like it'll never be eradicated. That's kind of being a pessimistic, although I consider myself to be optimistic. But I think racism will be with us throughout eternity. We'll just have to figure out how we will learn to become more of a kind and loving people. And if it's all right that we may be around people that are more like us, but we'd never want to degenerate or try to look at other people as if they're much less than we are. It's okay that I only want to be around black people. sometimes. It's okay if I don't want to socialize with black people. It's okay if you want to socialize with white, because they're much like you. They may like classical music, opera music. I like hip hop. And that's okay. But the thing is that we don't look at each other as I'm better than you. But it's still here. We got a long way to go. And I think your presence here today is hopeful to me. It says that you're still committed. And that you will never forget your history. Because anyone who don't remember their history are doomed to repeat it.
When you look at what divides us today as Americans, I think really it's Americans, we divide ourselves a lot of times. One instance that came to mind was the Black Lives Matter movement, and then the response to that, where we saw people would say, all lives matter, just completely missing the point, right? That it wasn't about police brutality and shooting unarmed black men, that now they had to co-opt the whole message and say, no, instead all lives matter. Or with some, you would see the back the badge signs in the front yard. Just not that that's a bad thing to do, but that again, it's completely missing the point. And so we just have this funny way of dividing ourselves. But I think it comes back to misunderstandings, really. Where another example would be, you look at the way a lot of people in the middle class, most oftentimes, people who pay the bulk of the taxes, they'll get so frustrated with welfare recipients and people who need food stamps to actually have enough food to live off of. And then they will just turn a blind eye to, say, the Koch brothers, who get hundreds of millions in tax incentives in places like Mississippi. And never mind the land grants, by the way, that white settlers who came to Mississippi a couple hundred years ago, the government just gave free land to white settlers, and then they cultivated that land off of slave ownership. And so we forget things so quickly, and we misunderstand each other and where we come from. And how do we grow out of that? I don't really know, other than just finding new ways to connect with each other. We'll talk more about that later, I think, as we continue in the discussion. But I feel like when it comes to divisions in America, it always comes back to we just don't understand one another a lot of times, and it doesn't really have to be that way.
So with all these ways of dividing ourselves, we do actually have much in common. Ironically, one of those commonalities is prejudice, which we could define as the tendency to form opinions and base our actions on something other than reason or actual experience. Another thing we have in common is our ability to change. So I'd like to ask each panelist to speak to what causes prejudice and what enables us to change. Sadie.
I just love going first. I have interesting stories to tell about prejudice. And they're so interesting that they're really sad. I say prejudice is taught, okay? Parents, once again, I'm going to parents. We forget that how we speak and what we speak goes into our children. It used to be in the old days that they'd tell the children to go outside if they had to gossip about somebody. But they don't do that anymore. My husband and I trucked for lots of years, because that's what he loved doing. And one day we were in a restaurant eating, and sometimes you look around at children in the restaurants, I know you do it, and you'll see some that are a little cuter than others, and you smile and you wave and whatever. So this little boy was looking at us as if he couldn't quite figure us out. And I mean, he was staring to the point where he's saying, okay, they've got a nose and an eyes and a mouth, but they don't look like me. So he turned to his mother and he says, is that what a nigger is, Mama? No, is that a nigger over there? Well, of course, she was so embarrassed that I think she turned 2 or 3 different colors. But what bothered me most of all was to know that the child said a word like they do with bad words. He was trying to say, I think I understood what they were talking about, but I'm not sure. That was sad. And then when I was in Atlanta working at the restaurant, one of my favorite and best workers was a white girl. And she was divorced. And she told me her ex-husband needed to drop the son off. He was 3 years old. So that she could have him for the weekend. And I told her that was no problem to do that because she was only going to be on the clock about another hour. So when he dropped the son off, of course, he went straight to where she was. He didn't bother to speak. And a little later on, she was saying, oh, this is my son. And he just wiped his hand straight across my face, to my dismay. So I just stood there. She said, my husband's a racist. My son's not been around black people. He's just trying to see if it comes off. I was saddened, really, really saddened, because that's the child that's going to grow up to be an ignorant child if somebody didn't bring a change to him. Prejudice, racism. We've got to do better.
So I believe strongly that both prejudice and the ability to change are human conditions. We are all, every single one of us, prejudiced. 19th century writer Anatole France said it this way: he prided himself on being a man without prejudice, and this itself is a very great prejudice. Our saving grace is that we can learn to resist prejudice. To me, the way we do that is it's a complex interaction of things that determines both what prejudice we feel and our propensity for change. It's family, culture, society, politics, personality, religion, what we value, what we fear, and who we meet.
Let me just share this one story that I think speaks about prejudice and what enables change. I certainly have prejudice, probably you can tell as I've talked today. But I had this prejudice about interracial marriages or interracial couples. I don't know why I didn't think that a black man should be with a white woman or a white woman should be with a black man. And that was a prejudice that I have. I'll admit I've moved forward. I mean, it doesn't infuriate me as much as it used to early in my life. But the one thing that probably enabled me is that as I evolved, certainly people I engaged with, I traveled all over the world. I have had an opportunity to travel in various countries and experience various cultures. And so I'm pretty sure that was part of the enablement of me changing my point of view, being a part of different cultures. But the one thing that I remember the most was that when we moved from California to New York, upstate New York, and my daughters were 8, 7, and 5 at the time. And I remember telling Deborah, who was my wife at the time, I said, we're moving to an area that's pretty much predominantly white. There are very few blacks in this neighborhood. I was in upstate New York. And so our daughters are going to be going to school with pretty much predominantly white folks. And I said, one day, our daughters may come home with a white boy for a boyfriend. How are we going to respond? And I realized, and Deborah, she was far beyond, she was much more accepting than I. But I think I realized at that point that as my daughters potentially could bring a Caucasian home as their mate, that I had to be accepting to that and allowing them to love whoever they wanted to love. And so I think that was a major enablement for me to move out of that prejudice that I had with interracial mixed couples or mixed marriages. But there are prejudices that are still in all of us, and there's also opportunities for us to change and evolve and move forward. But it has to be a conscious effort for us to do that.
And if I may, I want to say, I'm glad to hear them say that. Because yes, we black people have prejudices too. And we sometimes are prejudiced against each other for no reason. So, you know what? We're not saying that all white folk are prejudiced, or prejudice only exists in whites. That's not what we're saying. We're saying there are incidents in life where things just hit you harder than others.
What causes prejudice is a difficult question for me to answer, because I think what enables the change is the passage of time. And you see that with younger generations who don't really hold on to prejudices or stereotypes as much these days, while they still may exist with some people. But you can look at talking about it's learned and it's misunderstandings oftentimes. I think that one good example is people bring up in Mississippi the issue of the state flag, and they'll say that it's their heritage, that for that reason we have to keep it, and that no matter if half the population feels that it's a symbol of racism, that it's some people's heritage. But I always say, my family were German immigrants in the 1900s, so we didn't have that Confederate flag at any point. And so for me, it's just a disconnect, right? It's not something I can understand, why we would have those sorts of prejudiced feelings towards others. And so really, I think just as time goes on in places like Mississippi that are so deeply entrenched in history, and people feel that they have to cling to some heritage of a past that maybe wasn't the best or one worth remembering, everything about it all the time. Sometimes it is better to kind of forget. And with that being said, I just think that as time goes on, we're going to continue to change and move past our darker side of our history.
Okay, so we're going to wrap up the panel discussion now and try to bring it all back together. Bridging these divides can lead to solutions and better lives for all of us. So I'd like to finish up by getting each panelist to talk about how we might go forward. And you can choose what do the lessons of history offer us, or what aspect of life today as compared to the 60s might help us find new and innovative solutions. And I'll go first this time. So one of the lessons that I've taken from Freedom Summer is an understanding of the 1964 Freedom School model and how that can serve us today. So the Freedom Schools taught students their full history. They insisted that students question and taught them how to think critically and have difficult conversations. They helped students examine history from all angles in order to understand it as a series of choices made by fallible humans. I see critical thinking skills and knowing our history as fundamental to the preservation of our democracy. Education like this is somewhat rare. It's happening in some schools, notably in advanced placement history classes. So if you take a look at the high school student survivors of the Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School in Parkland, Florida, they've found their voices and become activists using skills they learned in advanced placement history, U.S. history classes. And they've recently announced that they're going on a 2-month nationwide bus tour to educate young people and get them registered and motivated to vote. Another example closer to home is at the Meridian Freedom Project, where they're carrying on some of the traditions of the 1964 Freedom Schools. So today, just as during Freedom Summer, students are our foundation for change, and the tenets of the Freedom Schools really advise us well on how to go about that. And so, what do we do though about all of us? Most of us here are beyond school age. I see some children in the front row here. But what we can do to compensate is community education and engagement events like we're at right now, reading, whether it's nonfiction or fiction, and making an effort to listen to each other, interact with common courtesy, and get to know each other as individuals rather than stereotypes. Eric.
One of the lessons that I learned, and certainly what happened that summer of '64, was that many of the college kids came down, and the primary reason for coming down was to go into these rural communities to get blacks registered to vote. And I registered to vote in 1975, right after I turned 18. And I actually registered unaffiliated because I like to view myself as an independent thinker and don't want to be party affiliate. But the thing that really stuck out to me is this idea of the power of the vote. I am a major advocate of the vote. People risk their lives for us to vote. There's not an election that I don't vote in, whether it's school board, whether it's some referendum, whatever, local, state, I vote. I cast my vote because my brother, James, rest his soul, he's no longer with us, but he told me the story that in that summer of '64 when Mickey Swanner and James Chaney were here, and James Chaney lived here, but James Chaney was kind of like his big brother, and Mickey Swanner was kind of like a mentor to him. And he would go with him in these rural areas in Mississippi to try to get blacks registered to vote. And he told me he came upon this one black man. They knocked on his door, and was going to try to get him to register to vote. And the black man came out his house with his shotgun cocked and was pointed right at my brother's head and told him to get off of his land, that he was not going to go register to vote, to have his family either killed or lose his job. But my point was that my brother was willing to risk his life to go out to get people to register to vote. And so this idea that the vote doesn't count, the vote does count. And if we look in recent elections, the election just happened in Virginia this year. Person won by one vote. If you look at what happened over in Alabama, and if you even look at the 2016 presidential election, the reason that we got Trump today is because of the non-voter who chose to stay home. You should never stay home and not cast your vote, because your vote is your voice. And I believe that if we want to see change happen, you need to be willing to cast your vote at any cost and at every election. At whatever elections are happening here locally, whether it's a school board election, or whether it's a city councilman, or whether it's a mayor election, you need to cast your vote, because your vote is your voice, and your vote do count. It counts. And I think the lesson that we can learn for certainly what has happened in the past during the civil rights era is that people risk their lives so that we can vote. And that's something that we should do every opportunity, because that's where we can make a difference and at least have an opportunity to see things move forward rather than what we're seeing with things moving backwards.
Okay, so I think that the lessons of history, at least for, again, the younger people growing up in the school system today, like, we hear all the stories, and of the civil rights era and prior to that, and all the horrible things that happened and the positive things that happened. And so I think with that comes a lot of lessons that eventually lead towards more progress when it comes to people losing their prejudice and things of that nature. But I also think when you look at the aspects of life today, that when compared to the 60s, we now have social media, which in a funny way has really exposed ourselves, because it's not that the hatefulness and the horrible things that people think and the things that people say, it's not that that's anything new. It's just that now we have a platform to share that with. And so by doing that, we're now seeing for the first time just how horrible it can be sometimes, and how many bad things people believe and what people think. And so with that comes an opportunity to correct that problem, because we're seeing millions of people being able to share and connect on such a broad scale with social media, that I think that when you look at, again, the misplaced anger that you see that leads to racism and prejudice, and you look at the misunderstandings between people, that social media allows for an opportunity to connect like never before. And with that, we can begin to understand each other and bridge the gap that's divided us. And eventually that might lead towards what you might call a movement that will actually make a real impactful difference, and maybe eliminate these prejudices and injustices for once and for all.